A common question I get asked is, do you need ND filters for video? And if so, what strength of ND filters do you need? And even further, should I get ND filters with polarization? ND filters do matter if you're trying to shoot cinematic video in bright environments. When it comes to polarization, it can depend on your shot. First off, let's get a better idea of what ND filters do and what polarizing filters do for your camera. ND filters are designed to reduce the amount of light that reaches your camera's sensor. If your exposure is too bright, shooting with an ND filter can help lower your exposure to a normal level without adjusting your camera settings. This is common for filming in bright environments while shooting at the 180-degree shutter angle, meaning your shutter speed is double your frame rate. For the example in this video, I was shooting at 24 frames per second, and my shutter speed was 1/50th. This achieves natural looking motion blur, and objects just look aesthetically pleasing to your eye without looking digital or too blurry. However, during the day, my aperture was a fixed 2.8 and my ISO was 100, and my shot looked really overexposed. This is where ND filters help. Another common question is, do you need ND filters for photography? And again, it depends on what you want to do. Shooting with a slow shutter speed during the day can allow for some motion blur in filming moving subjects, but it will also increase your exposure. This is where ND filters can help bring that exposure down to a normal level. Using the correct ND filter for your application will decrease your exposure to normal levels while maintaining the shutter speed that you want. Shooting landscapes at a slower shutter speed with an ND filter is common in photography, but hard to do with the drone. Wind and vibrations of hovering move the drone slightly, making for a pretty blurry image. It can be done with the drone, but it's difficult. Polarizing filters are designed to remove glare and reflections from objects in your shot. If you're filming reflective surfaces like cars, glass buildings, or water, it's a good idea to use a polarizing filter. Cutting down glare will add more detail to your shot where the glare was previously. Removing the glare will also bring down the overall exposure of your shot. One thing to keep in mind with polarizing filters, though, is that they need to be adjusted to the proper polarization to remove the glare and reflected light. It can be tricky to get proper alignment, but we're going to be using PolarPro's Vivid line that has a polarization indicator, and we're going to test to see if that does make it easier to judge the polarization. This is especially handy if you're using a drone, because if you get the polarization wrong, you're going to have to bring the drone back, land, adjust the polarization, and then go fly to your spot again. I went to my go-to testing spot in the middle of the day for maximum glare off the water. In this test, I flew without a lens to simulate what proper 180-degree shutter angle would look like without a filter. And I took the ND16 from DJI that came in the Flymore kit, and a polarized ND16pl from PolarPro's Vivid line of filters. Each of these filters have really slight different color casts from the regular stock no filter. But to make my editing life as easy as possible, I made some corrective LUTs with my color checker passport with each of these filters and no lens in DaVinci Resolve. If you're interested in my Cinelike to neutral LUT for the no filter, DJI filter, and the PolarPro filter that I'm using in this video, check out the link in the description below. For camera settings, I was staying with the 180-degree shutter rule at 24 frames per second. My ISO was 100 and my fixed 2.8 aperture. First up, no filter. This was obviously overexposed and needs some major help. This is where the ND16 from DJI comes in to bring the overall exposure of our shot down. The ND filter helps bring our exposure down without adjusting our camera settings. You can see the edges of the frame where the pier is moving quickly. There is some gentle motion blur that the slower shutter speed is allowing us to capture. The blur is more obvious in faster moving subjects, but for the sake of this test, this is the most motion blur we're going to get here. Next up is the polarized ND16 filter from PolarPro. This filter is following PolarPro's best practices, where we're filming with the line of the filter at 12 o'clock on the top of the filter. This seems to hold true and have a polarizing effect on our footage. The ND16 is keeping our exposure just as low as the DJI filter was, but in addition to cutting down the light that's hitting our camera, the filter is also removing some of the glare off of the water as well. You can tell the difference in reflections when comparing the ND16pl to the ND16 side by side. After flying the PolarPro filter at 12 o'clock, I decided to adjust the filter to 6 o'clock to see how it affected our overall image. Overall, the image looks pretty similar, maybe not as strong as 12 o'clock. After that flight, I wanted to find a spot where the filter didn't perform as well, just to make sure I'm getting the best performance out of this filter. So I decided to put the filter at the 9 o'clock position and see how well it worked. As suspected, the polarization didn't work as well, and the overall image was brighter due to the lack of polarization. The filter performs more like an ND16 and maybe even like an ND8, just because it wasn't properly aligned. One thing to mention here though is that the polarizing filter will remove most indirect glare, but it won't remove all glare. There's still some glare coming off the water where the sun is directly hitting off of the water into the lens. So even if you're using a polarizing filter and it's properly aligned, there will still be some amount of direct glare or reflection affecting your image. The polarizer cuts out the large majority of reflections, but not all of them. This is most apparent when you're looking at the water straight down from the top of the pier. While the polarizer did a good job at removing indirect reflections coming off of the water, the direct reflections from the sun were almost the same on all of these filters, even the polarized filter. If you're going to be shooting cinematic video in the middle of the day or any time of the day, you're probably going to need an ND filter. Where filters get interesting is when you add polarization to the mix. If you have indirect reflections coming off of surfaces, the polarizer can cut off the light reflecting from those surfaces, only if it's properly aligned. And if it's not properly aligned, it can work the same as a regular ND filter, maybe a little weaker, but you could experience some weird cross patterns or dark spots in the polarization if you're not careful. If you do not need to cut out reflections, regular old ND filters are going to be the easiest to use. If you do need to cut down reflections on your shots, make sure you're using a polarizing filter and make sure it's aligned properly. I like that the Polar Pro filters have the alignment marker. It just makes your life a little bit easier getting that polarization correct. Another common question I get asked is what ND strengths do you recommend and for what times? I'll give a brief overview of the ND filters that I'm shooting with when I'm shooting 24 frames per second. And just as a disclaimer, this is an oversimplification. I live in Ohio, and if you live in a brighter area, you may need to go up a strength, but here we go, oversimplification. I use an ND4 at golden hour when it's overcast. I use an ND8 at golden hour when it's clear. ND16 for the middle of the day in semi-cloudy conditions, like the example footage in this video. ND32 for blazing hot, bright days with no clouds. I've only used an ND64 a few times in super bright conditions that were closer to the equator. If I had to choose only 3 filters to go with, I would choose an ND8, an ND16, and an ND32. These are the filters I use most when I'm out shooting cinematic video at 24 frames per second. I was recently in California for a week driving the Pacific Coast Highway from San Francisco to San Diego, and I didn't use anything over an ND32. And a helpful tip if you're out using an ND32 and you're still too bright shooting at 24 frames per second, you can bump up your frame rate and then you have to bump up your shutter speed as well to maintain that natural looking motion blur. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second with the Mavic Air, for example, in 4K and it's too bright, shoot 4K 60 and increase your shutter speed. You'll still have the same amount of motion blur when you slow your footage down, but it'll be darker and you will get away with that ND64 while using an ND32. That was a little confusing and kind of technical, but hopefully that helps when you're choosing between no filter, ND filter, and polarized ND filter. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend. If you didn't like this video, share it with someone you don't like. Thanks for sticking around to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.